Okay, now Zimbabweans today are commemorating 43 years of independence, but the country has been in the grip of economic sanctions imposed by the United States 20 years ago, further worsening poverty there. With elections looming later this year, the civic space is rapidly contracting, including the criminalization of dissent and the targeting of political activists and human rights activists. Well, let's unpack this further as we look at a 43-year-old Zimbabwe with Amnesty International researcher Nkululeko Majozi. Nkululeko, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. Just reading that intro to our chat now just tells me that democratic spaces in Zimbabwe have been suffocated 43 years later, besides the economic hardship. I mean, what's there to celebrate in Zim?
Good afternoon, Paten, and thanks for having me. Well, as you rightly say, Zimbabwe is celebrating 43 years of independence from colonial rule. That's one thing that the country can celebrate, being free from colonial rule. But as you rightly point out, civic space is rapidly shrinking in the country. It has been shrinking for a while. And what we are seeing is that the country now is characterized by an intolerance for dissent, whereby political activists and human rights defenders are being actively targeted by authorities for expressing dissent. What we are seeing concretely on the ground is that the government and authorities in Zimbabwe are failing to uphold the constitutional rights to freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and the rights of people to protest, essentially. And as Amnesty International, we are calling on the government of Zimbabwe and authorities to stop criminalizing dissent in the country and to ensure the leveling of the playing field in the country as we fast approach the elections later in the year.
Yeah, if you talk about leveling of playing fields and talk about equality, what comes to mind, I would assume you've seen the Al Jazeera investigation into gold trafficking and resource theft, involving billions of dollars, and mentioning Emmerson Mnangagwa, the president of Zimbabwe, and other senior officials involved, which has robbed the country of much needed resources and placed the wealth in political elites.
Yes, very much. The issue of corruption is a great challenge in Zimbabwe, and it's also fueling the pressure in terms of the realization of social economic rights of the people of Zimbabwe. What you find in the country is that people's socio-economic rights, people's rights to health, people's rights to social protection, people's rights to a dignified life with employment and a good opportunity at making it in life are being trampled upon, and the issue of authorities being involved in such corruption is only making matters worse, as it takes away resources into the investment of the things that are needed for people to realize their socio-economic needs. It's taking away from that, and people are further being pushed into a dire crisis, a socio-economic crisis, a crisis of unemployment, a crisis of a lack of good access to health. The health system in Zimbabwe is in tatters as we speak, and the siphoning of the country's funds and resources and minerals in terms of gold and so on is only adding fuel to fire in that aspect.
Yeah, from Amnesty International's perspective, I mean, your people on the ground, your colleagues on the ground, what are you seeing? Are you seeing a deepening of authoritarianism in Zimbabwe? I'm asking this because of the history of how ZANU-PF has dealt with opposition, like the Movement for Democratic Change.
Yes, very much so. What we are seeing, which is characteristic of many countries in the Southern Africa region, is that there's a a clamp down on civil and political rights of people, particularly the right to protest, people's rights, to people's freedom to peaceful assembly, people's rights to freedom of expression. What we've seen recently with the conviction and sentencing of the spokesperson of the main opposition party, the CCC in Zimbabwe, Fezai Mahere. She was recently convicted and sentenced for a tweet that she had posted in 2021, where she shared an image of a policeman tussling with a woman carrying a lifeless body of a child, and she was arrested and detained for 7 days for that, and released on bail. And she was recently now convicted and sentenced for that, under the charge of spreading falsehoods or false information. So what we are seeing in Zimbabwe essentially is what we are characterizing as persecution through prosecution, whereby the ruling party is using the legal system and the courts to target political activists, and particularly members of the opposition, to silence them and to silence dissent. Another classic example is the issue of the chairperson of the CCC, Job Sikala, who has been in detention now for over 300 days. It's nearly now a year of him being in incarceration without having a fair trial.
Okay. Final question to you, Nkululeko. From what you've just answered, would it be a fair assessment if we were to postulate and say Zimbabwe is in for a long history of political repression going forward?
As matters stand right now, all the evidence is pointing to a continuation of a shrinking of civic space. It was hoped when President Emerson Mnangagwa came into power back in 2017 and voted in 2018, that there would be a change in the country's fortunes, and that a new chapter of the respect of human rights will be witnessed in the country. But what we have seen so far is a deepening of autocratic tendencies by the regime in Zimbabwe, characterized by the criminalization of dissent, preventing people from exercising their right to freedom of expression, to freedom of assembly. Also, the abduction of political activists and the forced disappearance of activists. So what we have seen in the past 5 years is a worsening situation in which civil and political rights people, as well as socio-economic rights of people, have been clamped down on.
What freedom is there to celebrate for Zimbabweans listening to you, Nkululeko Majozi? It's a tough one indeed. Thank you very much, Nkululeko Majozi, researcher at Amnesty International, just telling us about the situation on the ground in Zim as they're marking 43 years of independence from Britain on this day, the 18th of April.